Great, thanks, Joanne. Could pull it up my slides as well. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and thanks, Michelle, for laying a great foundation for sort of more of the discussion that we'll have this afternoon, especially on this idea of co-benefits. You brought up that co-benefits not otherwise quantified in publications or other research outputs, or even for that matter in reporting requirements. But I would argue, and I'm going to talk about this, how often it's these co-benefits that may actually be fundamental for transformation to occur. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the work I've been doing, especially as it relates to working within First Nations communities around agricultural land management, and whether or not or how these programs and initiatives targeting climate smart agriculture might or may not align with Indigenous community priorities. So next slide, please. And a key thing that I'm bringing into this discussion is sort of the multi-layered relationships that are required. I think it's really important to, we center farmers as the primary land decision makers in our agricultural systems, but I'm offering another layer of decision making that happens, especially in First Nations, because the communities themselves are the land holders, even if they may not be the ones farming. And so there's sort of a multiplicity of connections and decision makers that are at play in these contexts. So before I kind of dive into that aspect, I first want to start by talking about First Nations, Indigenous peoples, and climate change. Just globally, and certainly here in Canada, Indigenous peoples are often on the front lines of climate change. They're usually communities that are most impacted by wildfires, floods, and because of these environmental changes and impacts of climate change, we can lose access to food availability, habitat declines, and other pressures that can make way, such as invasive species. But at the same time, Indigenous and First Nations people also play a really important role in climate change mitigation through land governance and application of traditional Indigenous knowledge, as well as values onto the land. In Canada, there is now a legislative requirement to consider Indigenous knowledge in any kind of emissions targets and programs that arise from those targets or meeting those targets. But at the same time, there hasn't really been clear guidance on how or whether Indigenous knowledge can be integrated into these climate change policies. And without that sort of more clear guidance or clear indication, we can risk it being, or Indigenous knowledge being, tokenized or cherry-picked when convenient. So can you go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to sort of talk about some of the work that has been ongoing in the last number of years, really spurred by Canada's commitment to net zero in the agriculture sector, with increased funding programs, not only for research that I might be involved in, but also implementation programs like OFCAF that are geared towards farmers and land managers to be able to implement climate smart agricultural practices or beneficial management practices. But there hasn't necessarily been, again, sort of a clear understanding of how Indigenous people might fit or how they may access these programs, and whether or not these programs are designed well for Indigenous peoples to actually engage in them effectively. Next slide, please. So just to create a bit of context for On the Prairies, there are over 100 First Nations communities across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And most of these nations south of the boreal forest do have agricultural lands. And so kind of on a broad scale, maybe much less than the broader farming sector in terms of number of acres, but still in any given community there may be thousands to tens of thousands of cropland acres, plus pasture land, that are stewarded within their nations. And so how can decision makers, land managers work with farmers who are farming that land to ensure that the land is being stewarded in a way that reflects their priorities and community values, and what options are out there to provide the resources and the support to align values with what is actually happening on the land base itself. Next slide, please. So one of the programs that I'm involved with, and I guess I'll actually backtrack a little bit. As some of these funding streams emerged in the early 2020s. Prior to this, there was really, really limited availability of any sort of support programs that Indigenous communities, especially First Nations communities, could access to be able to, make improvements or changes within their agricultural initiatives, or to support any changes on their agricultural land base. And prior to some of the more recent federal funding kind of targeted towards net zero initiatives, I, as well as some other researchers and community members and nonprofit organizations, had been collaborating for a number of different years in other ways. And when announcements were made for these funding opportunities, and specifically I'll talk about the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Lab, when that announcement was made and when it was made clear that Indigenous communities could be eligible to actually apply for these funds, as a group, we were pretty well positioned to try to take advantage of this, because we knew that there was a lot of work that we wanted to get done within communities to better understand, our agricultural systems, but also to be able to make change to those systems. We needed to have bigger resources than what we had initially been kind of able to access prior to this. And so what arose was the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky, which is a living lab that is led by Mistawasis Nehewak, which is a First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. It's located about an hour north of Saskatoon. We're in the Black Soil Zone. We're just on that, in the Aspen Parkland, and just south of that boreal transition zone, and in partnership with Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, which is another First Nations community that is neighboring to Mistawasis. And so both of these communities have relatively large agricultural land bases, but within each community, much of that land is actually being farmed by non-Indigenous producers who are nearby. And so one of the really big issues that both communities have been grappling with is that there has been a relatively disconnection between the farmer who's making those on the ground management decisions and the community itself, who is seeing the impacts of agriculture and not necessarily feeling that it's aligning with what they want to see on the land. So there's been concerns about, the impacts of, say, pesticide applications, of impacts to water quality, or access to plants that might be used for traditional medicines, or for ceremonial use. And so there was a lot of concerns that have arisen over the last number of decades for both communities that we're hoping that we can, and actually have been working more closely with farmers to try to address for both communities. Next slide, please. So the goals of the Bridge to Land, Water, Sky are really holistic. We've got number one, the goal to improve land management strategies. So this is where we're looking at implementing, these innovations, these climate smart agricultural practices, these beneficial management practices, and then go out and monitor to see if anything, if the implementation actually does achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions or improvements improvements in carbon storage. So there's sort of that climate smart piece, that net zero piece fits within this top little improve land management strategies goals. But that's just one of 5 goals. The other goals are to increase food security and sovereignty, to protect biodiversity and water, to create employment and learning opportunities for youth and communities, and to reimagine relationships between the Indigenous First Nations landowners, landholders, and the producers that are renting agricultural land. And I would argue without this focus and this goal in improving those relationships, we would never be able to achieve any kind of improvements to net zero. So, fundamentally, it's important to also think about these other co-benefits if we're going to actually realize on what the Canadian government has set forward in terms of net zero emissions mitigation. Can we next slide, please? So I just want to highlight a couple of examples that have come out of Bridge to Land, Water, Sky activities. And so one of the things is that, when we're using sort of this co-developed research between researchers and farmers. In the case of Bridge to Land, Water, Sky, we also had community members as that third party to co-develop. And in this case, the community, Mr. Wasis had identified a parcel of land that has some historical significance, but also has been undergoing quite severe soil degradation. So this is kind of what I'm going to describe is what we're calling the restoration of the Green Lake Trail in Mr. Wasis. So the Green Lake Trail is actually a historical fur trading route, probably actually predates the fur trade that spans hundreds of kilometers, sort of from like northwest to more towards the southeast across Saskatchewan. And it was a fur trading route, and that trail actually runs right through Mistawasa. So it's a really important sort of historical route. Currently, it is an agricultural field on very sandy soils, and community members still actually use that trail to get across the community. So it's still an active trail. Next slide. But you can see major soil degradation, and I borrowed a photo from our agronomist, and the actual title, the name of the file was "Wheat Not Worth Harvesting." You can see that in the picture to the right, that very low productivity, very marginal. Any inputs that are being added to this land are not being realized. And so earlier last spring, actually in June, there was a seeded forage that was seeded into this area to basically restore and add some plant cover to be able to mitigate some of those impacts of pretty severe soil erosion. Next slide. And I'll speed things up so I can get through in time. Next slide, please. And at Muskeg Lake, Cree Nation, another location that was determined from the community was selecting an already existing food forest that the community had implemented a number of years ago, which has become an important community gathering space. And just across the road from the food forest, we've actually implemented different demonstration sites of different BMPs, including intercropping, different cover crop demonstrations, and again, really centering around community education as being the primary goal. Next slide, please. So the work that has been able to emerge out of working with both Muskeg Lake Cree Nation and Mistawasis Nehewak is to expand our understanding of Indigenous agriculture beyond those two communities to other communities in the prairies. And we're doing so through a soil and agroecosystem project, or the SAGE project, as well as another research project that Michelle already mentioned called The LEAP, where we're looking more closely at identifying priorities and values that are driving agricultural land use decision-making within especially First Nations communities. Next slide, please. All this to say that, to be able to meet these sort of external or, national or even global targets for making change, whether it's to support climate mitigation or improve biodiversity, Indigenous communities have a lot of other reasons for why they might pursue these different projects. So, from food security to bison rematriation to protecting water to language revitalization. And so I think it's really important to, I guess, emphasize that there's multitudes I guess, interactions and a more holistic approach that we need to consider. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the funders, the partners, the team. Like Michelle said, it takes a literal village sometimes to get this work done. So thank you very much, and I will end there.